Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. Okay, so today, this episode, we're talking about incels. This is something that's been kind of online and kind of got offline, and people are kind of talking about this a little bit more. I'm talking with William Costello, which I was very, very happy to talk to him. We've been trying to get together for some time, and we finally sat down and talked for a couple hours about his research and his work on incels. Will has a master's in psychology, culture, and evolution from Brunel University in London. He's worked a variety with people, and he's currently getting his in the PhD program, Individual Differences in Evolutionary Psychology, in David Buss's Evolutionary Psychology Lab. So a lot of good people coming out of there. He's presented his research in a variety of places, a lot of conferences, and he's been really I mentioned in the conversation, he's kind of been all over the place. You know, he's been on a bunch of pretty good fellow podcasts and talking about his research, and people are interested in this. And so I don't know him personally, obviously. He's delightful, talking with him. But I've talked to other people that know him, and so his circles kind of are small. And so I was like, I gotta talk to William. So not only heard good things about him, and I was not disappointed. We started the conversation just by talking about sexuality generally and how that's defined. How do we define sexuality? We talk about defining incels. Who are these folks, and what are some of the features or characteristics of incels? We talk about the importance of sexual selection and understanding some of the evolutionary history of that to try and understand kind of where this kind of group of incels kind of fits in here. We talk about how much of incels is part of online culture or how much of it is out in the world. Sometimes there are things that just kind of start online or feel very online, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist out in the real world, so to speak. And so we talk about that bit of it. We talk about the manosphere, quote unquote. We talk about what that is. We talk about modern masculinity and some of the different messages men get from society, some public thinkers and intellectuals, and how they talk about men or talk to men, and certain kind of messages they're giving, and whether that's positive or negative overall. And so we list off and reference some of the things that appear to be pretty helpful. We talk about some of the cultural perceptions of incels. They usually get a pretty negative perception, and why that is, and how that arrives. We talk about them incels as being violent. So there's this kind of stereotype, or there's these ideas that incels have some proclivity to violence, and we kind of talk about how true that is or isn't. And then we're talking about clinical treatment for incels. Again, this is still new research. This is still kind of bursting onto the scene. William's kind of on the front lines of that. So it's good research to try and understand the what's going on with these folks, but then also how do we then get treatment, as he lists out that they're prone to all sorts of mental health issues. And so trying to understand the phenomenon and then trying to provide some ways of doing treatment is important. I absolutely really enjoy this conversation. As I said, William's a really, really good guy. He's doing some really, really good research with some really good folks, and I'm really excited to see where his research goes the next couple of years, and how we can understand kind of this group of people. As always, make sure to subscribe to my free Substack, convergentdialogues.substack.com, and listen to this conversation and all the other conversations. And so now I bring you William Costello. I'm here with William Costello. William, it's really nice to have you on the podcast. I'm very excited to talk with you.
I'm happy to be here. I'm a big fan and admirer of the podcast, so it's actually really gratifying to be invited on, and happy to speak to you.
You are much too kind, and thank you for listening and being a big fan. I really do appreciate that. And of course, I want to talk to you. I know you've been quite popular. You've been on other people's podcasts. You've been talking about your research, and so you're quite the person to get nowadays.
Yeah, it's not my first podcast rodeo. I've been doing the circuit.
That's nice. So why don't you tell people who you are, just your background and what you're currently studying and what you're currently interested in?
Sure. So my name's William Costello, and in 2021, I graduated from Brunel University in London with a master's degree in psychology, culture, and evolution, where under the supervision of Professor Dave Schmidt, my dissertation investigated some of the first empirical research into the psychology of incels, involuntary celibates. And then in 2022, I moved to Austin, Texas to join Dr. David Buss's evolutionary psychology lab, where I'm a PhD student of individual differences and evolutionary psychology. And I'm continuing to kind of build on the research I started during my master's with a couple of other projects to study the incel community further.
Yeah, no, it's there's not a lot of research on this, so it's really, really good to hear that someone's doing this, and that you're, Dave Schmidt to Dave Buss. I mean, those are some fantastic guys, and so I've obviously talked to Dave Buss. I've had many of his former students on here as well, so it's always nice to see that he's still training and mentoring good people like yourself. So it's always good to see.
Yeah, I'm really pleased with my collection of mentors because in between Dave Schmidt and David Buss, I also had Andrew Thomas mentoring me at Swansea University, where I'm an honorary research assistant, and he's brilliant as well. So I'm quite pleased with my collection of those three. I think I'm the only one who has that collection. So yeah, I'm quite proud of that.
You got the Trinity over there, which is great. So I guess the first thing I want to do is I want to kind of just start by defining some terms. We'll get to incels of sorts and what that looks like and everything. But I guess I want to I usually like to start very, 30,000 foot broad picture and then kind of narrow in. So I guess one thing before we get to the incel piece is about what I want to know is about sexuality. And so, obviously it's a big question, big topic, but, kind of with the eye on, incels, because that's what we'll focus on. How do you typically understand and define sexuality as a construct and or as a spectrum? Where does all that sit? Because then we can know kind of the grid we can place, where incels can or fit in certain categories or things like that. So maybe just generally, how do you kind of think of this?
Okay, so from the 30,000 foot lens, I think we need to approach kind of sexuality or sex psychology or mating psychology through that evolutionary lens. So the adaptive problems of finding and retaining a mate have represented the fundamental problems for humans since the beginning. So we build billion-dollar industries around them in dating apps and cosmetic surgery. All of this kind of gives us an idea that it's really, really important. So these problems of finding and retaining a mate, given that they're so important, evolution by sexual and natural selection has equipped us with a suite of psychological mechanisms that attend to those problems. So, for example, forming mate preferences, assessing our own mate value, ascertaining what members of the opposite sex value in a mate, which is like a component of mating intelligence, the ability to accurately mind read the opposite sex, and deciding on which targets we should concentrate our mating efforts relative to our own mate value. So given it's so interesting that from the incel piece then that you have these fundamental adaptive problems that seem front and center in almost everyone's mind, yet we have a growing group of people who strongly identify with what they perceive as their inability to solve these important problems. These are incels, aka involuntary celibates. Incels could be best understood as a largely online subculture community of men. They form their sense of identity around their perceived inability to form sexual or romantic relationships. A significant minority of these incels engage in misogynistic online hostility, but some research has found that the vast majority of this online hate comes from just 10% of incel accounts, the extreme minority. And then in rare individual cases, some incels have even lashed out at society in violent rage. Most notable there is the case of Elliot Rodger, who in 2014 killed 6 people and injured 14 others before killing himself. And he left behind a 149-page manifesto referring to a day of retribution where he was going to kill the Chads and Stacys that he most envied. Chads referring to the sexually successful men, and Stacy's referring to the sexually attractive women who reject him. So that's a kind of a few different lenses you can look at the incel definition from, but it is a really important question of what type of definition of incel are we talking about? So are we referring to just the life circumstance, someone who finds themselves identifying with that circumstance of feeling they're unable to form sexual or romantic relationships? Are we talking about a member of a smaller online subculture? Are we talking about a specific ideological worldview? That doesn't seem, I don't think anyone has really captured broad agreement among incels on a lot of things. And then additionally, to make things even worse, incel as a term has now come to just represent a mere insult. You even find married men online sometimes being called incels if they're just misogynistic or if they're just seen as creepy or something. So I mentioned there that it's hard to get incels to kind of agree on a lot. But one thing that they tend to, or at least the online subculture incels very much agree on, is something called the philosophy or worldview known as the black pill. So the black pill is derived of this idea from the red pill from the movie The Matrix, which denotes a willingness to see the world as it really is, as opposed to the blissful ignorance of taking the blue pill. So for incels, the black pill describes a particularly bleak truth to swallow. And in this case, it's the belief that sexual attraction is mostly fixed and that there is nothing that incels can do to improve their romantic prospects. So you have a lot of agreement about the black pill among the very online incels, for sure. To look at the incel piece from the standpoint I'm most interested in, the evolutionary psychology kind of component, Candace Blake and Rob Brooks have a really great new paper that just came out where they talk about how society should not ignore their incel problem. And they describe the incel problem as being a modern manifestation of an ancient problem. And by that, they mean that we have always had incels. And that is, we've always had, males have had a far greater variability of reproductive success than females. If we consider that 93% of human societies have been preferentially polygynous, meaning one high-status male with multiple wives, although even among those societies, the majority of mateships in those societies would be monogamous, but it just meant that many men in societies would have died before reproducing. And Joe Henrich highlights how monogamy taking hold as a cultural norm, that it did so because the cultures that ensured monogamy was a strong cultural norm ensured that there was a more egalitarian distribution of mates. And those cultures flourished more than those that didn't. Because the dangerous thing is, in those societies where you have a surplus population of unpartnered young men, they disproportionately harm themselves and others in society because of their elevated levels of risk-taking and status striving. In evolutionary psychology, we call this young male syndrome, and it's one of the most consistent findings across time and across cultures, is that particular portion, those sexless young men, are the most dangerous. So there is good reason to take seriously the incel problem. But to kind of engage with this idea of the definition of inceldom, for me, it does require some degree of being motivated to choose that identity, because it is impossible for us to objectively prove that someone can't form sexual or romantic relationships. So it does involve some level of personal choice to retreat from the mating market rather than keeping on trying. And, initially when I started thinking about the incel topic, I thought, how could somebody come to define themselves this way? Why would they focus on this? I couldn't understand, what do they get out of it? But the more I looked at it, I actually came to realize that incels do get a lot out of their identity. They get a sense of fraternity, they get a common enemy, a black and white rubric through which to view the world. They get a victimhood identity, which is very, very in vogue these days. They get a rich, fun lexicon of terminology to troll with. And most importantly, from my point of view, they get an excuse to no longer participate in what they consider an exhausting, expensive, and anxiety-inducing mating market that they just don't find rewarding. So, maybe who could blame us, or who could blame incels for not wanting to participate anymore? if they're not having much success, and they just are retreating into the online worlds.
Yeah, so you lay it out very nicely, and I'm wondering here. So there's a bunch of questions I have about this, but I guess the one thing is, I guess, about like the sort of capacity or the innate capacity, right? Of is it? It does seem like an identity type of thing, and for the reasons you listed out, which there's something to that. But of course, I don't think it's just that. But I guess from the evolutionary perspective is there are can we say that there are just some men that are just not going to be attractive or kind of like they're not going to be chosen for mate selection of sorts, or that they're just always going to be in the recycle bin, if you will. And is it if that's the case, is that something about them physically, personally, across many different potential mates?
Yeah, I mean, I'm reluctant to kind of pathologize incels too much as having something very kind of unique and innate about them. But there is attraction inequality on the mating market, in that most men find more women attractive than vice versa. So it did take that kind of strict monogamy norm to produce that egalitarian distribution on the mating market. And maybe in recent decades, we've kind of eroded that norm and liberated women into the workplace very successfully. So it might be just the case that a lot of the men who were being selected for in recent decades are no longer being considered eligible, because we no longer have that strict economic necessity for women to settle with men they don't want, or the strict monogamy norm. If I think about my female friends, I wouldn't advise them to settle for someone they didn't want. They'd rather be single, or they'd rather have no sex or no relationships than have sex or relationships they don't want. And I think this is a real failure of cross-sex mind reading on the behalf of incels, because incels often talk about how there's no such thing as a real femcel. There's no female equivalent. And initially, I kind of thought, okay, I can maybe see what they're coming from with that idea, that most women, we could argue, could go out and get sex or get a relationship if they want, but it just might not be the sex or relationship that they really wanted. But the more I think about it, that actually amounts to the same thing, because for women, for incels, and maybe most men, more is always better than none. So some is always better than none in terms of sex or relationships. I kind of think that sex or relationships is like pizza for men. There's good pizza and there's pizza. There's no bad pizza. But that's not the case for women. Women would rather have none than bad sex or a bad relationship, because for women, with such a high degree of parental investment and sex being so risky, sex they don't want could actually be cost inflicting, or really like worse than nothing. So that's where I think incels, and men in particular, don't maybe see the female analog, that it can be the same thing.
Yeah, I was going to ask about, do we see this for some analog to this with females? But I guess the one question I have here is about the idea of, this seems like a very new phenomenon. And so in our evolutionary past, whether it was called something else or not, do we think that incels have always been around for thousands of years? These men that are just not wanted by women, they don't have mates, they're seen as undesirable for X and Y reasons. Like, what do we think about the evolutionary history of incels?
Yeah, I think something to point out is that, yes, you would have had these groups. They wouldn't be kind of coalitionally organizing the way we find incels doing so online now. Obviously, the internet provides a vehicle for them to do that. But culturally, we would have had institutions to kind of deal with this surplus population of unpartnered young men. So even war and exploring might have been I heard Robin Dunbar talking on a recent podcast about how the Portuguese explorers did so in large part because they had these surplus populations of young men that they didn't want hanging around causing trouble. So they created a mission for them to go off exploring. or you might have had the monastery. And so we don't appear to have those outlets, and perhaps thankfully so. We're not sending our surplus population of young men off raiding like Vikings. The Vikings on TV are often depicted as very, very attractive and sexy looking men, but that might not have been the case, really. They would have been the kind of the leftover men in your society was more accurate of what they were probably like. But maybe thankfully we don't have those outlets, but how we might have other outlets like the internet. So internet, these online worlds seem to be where incels are gathering for long periods of time. And while some of them engage in this misogynistic hostility, the online worlds might actually be pacifying these young men in a way that's preventing them from causing more real world harm. We might actually expect that incels should be an even more disruptive force in society, but they might be kind of have their status driving psychology hijacked by these online worlds, which could be a positive that we don't recognize, or a lesser evil than causing trouble in the real world.
Yeah. So let me ask, I'll definitely come to the online feature of this, but what are, I guess, just kind of describe the major features or demographics, for obviously there's variance here, but for what we see to kind of characterize an incel. Is it just low well-being, body image, shame? What are the kind of hallmark features of what that would look like?
Sure. So our study for my master's dissertation was some of the first empirical studies to have primary responses from incels themselves. I managed to recruit 151 self-identified incel participants. And our study asked participants for basic demographic and political information, and to complete a series of standard mental health questionnaires, including the PHQ-9 for depression and the GAD-7 for anxiety. And these are scales that are used by the NHS National Health Service in the UK. So we can clinically kind of diagnose using these scales. And I also investigated the tendency for interpersonal victimhood scale, which is a new personality construct that I think is really interesting. So the tendency for interpersonal victimhood is comprised of 4 dimensions. Number 1 is the need for recognition, and that describes a preoccupation with having the legitimacy of grievances acknowledged. And this made a lot of sense to me for incels, because engaging with incels online, the worst thing you could say to them is to not acknowledge how difficult they have it. They actually would prefer you agree with them and say, yes, you really are going to struggle on the mating market. They don't want someone to say, you know what, you're not so bad, you could go out and get a mate, sure, come on. They hate that. So they have this real need for recognition. The second dimension is a moral elitism, and that describes the belief that the individual or their in-group behaves more morally than others. And you might see that in incels in the way they maybe sneer at the superficiality of what we reward in the mating market. They describe Chad and Stacey as very superficial and kind of lacking in intellectual qualities at the expense of, or just focusing on physical attractiveness at the expense of intellectual qualities. The third dimension of the victimhood scale is the lack of empathy. And with incels, this describes that they believe that because of their past victimization, they begin to care less about the victimization of others. So no one cares about my pain. Why should I care about anyone else's? So the fourth dimension of the victimhood construct is rumination. And that's the preoccupation with reflecting on their perceived past instances of being victimized. And this all fits very well with the idea of the black pill. So incels scored significantly higher on this tendency for interpersonal victimhood than non-incels. In terms of demographics and socioeconomic status, we were surprised to learn that incels were pretty, had a broad political affiliations. There wasn't any overwhelming right-wing overrepresentation, despite that they're described like that in the media most commonly. They're described as, white supremacist or right-wing, far right. But in our findings, we found that 38% of the participants described themselves as right-leaning, 44% as left-leaning, and 17% as centrist. Now, it's something we'd like to dig into a little bit further. That's just one item, asking individuals to say where they identify on a scale. In our next study, which we're going to launch in a couple of weeks, we're going to actually dig into political beliefs and the character and nature of those a little bit more, because in the next study we'll be in a position to pay participants, and we can ask them to answer more questions, and we'll hopefully be able to get some richer data on that. But it was a surprising finding. We also found that a smaller proportion than would be expected by chance, given that we had a majority US and UK sample, a smaller proportion than would be expected by chance identified as white. We had found that 36% of our sample were incels of color. So that was a surprising finding. But incels often talk about what they perceive as racism on the mating market. So this idea that incels were kind of a white supremacist offshoot never really made much sense to me, given a lot of the incel talking points. We also found that 17% of incels were not engaged in education, employment, or training. They were NEET. And this is compared to only 9% of non-incels in our sample. So nearly twice as many incels were NEET than non-incels. 36% of incels had a high school level education or lower, compared to 20% of non-incels. And 50% of incels reported living with their parents or a caregiver, compared to 27% of non-incels. In terms of the well-being, this is where we found some real stark findings. So using those clinical measures from the NHS, the PHQ-9 and the GAD-7, we were able to find that 75% of incels in the study were clinically diagnosable with severe or moderate depression, and 67% with severe or moderate or moderately severe anxiety. They also scored significantly higher on loneliness scales, lower on life satisfaction, and also, unsurprisingly, had a much lower sense of self-perceived mate value. And self-perceived mate value can be taken as a direct proxy for self-esteem, particularly for men. So it's my position that given these findings, and some other studies have found similarly low well-being levels, that when we're asked about what extreme inceldom looks like, we're often asked to think about incels as a form of extremism, but we should consider that in extreme inceldom might actually look more like suicidality than potentiality for violence. And other studies have found that 82% of incels had considered suicide. So they're an extremely at-risk group that needs some help.
Yeah, that's a really important point that you make there at the end. So in understanding all of these characteristics, then this is a hard question, I guess, to ask, but this isn't necessarily a choice, this kind of lifestyle. And again, I'm using that term in scare quotes, right? The free will, arguments aside, choosing and all that. But how do I guess we understand the motivations or inspiration for people that are living this way, if we see it as a type of choosing for the lifestyle, or is there elements of it where there are some things that are true or not true, or that they're prone to certain mental illness or suicidality or loneliness or hopelessness, and then they just kind of go all in on it, and then have this way of adopting this as an identity and a lifestyle and lean into it. How do we understand those kind of components to it?
Yeah, and there is like a chicken and egg thing of those findings I've just described don't necessarily make for the most attractive mate, right? And there could be a bi-directional effect there, whereby you're depressed because you can't find a mate, and then you can't find a mate because you're depressed, and they all kind of tie into each other a lot. And even the socioeconomic status, given what we know about women's mate preference for financial prospects, those figures alone, improving the material conditions of young men's lives, might be enough for many incels. But yeah, it's about this idea, like, is it clear? It's not clear to me that engaging with the mating market is the solution for most, or for all or most incels. That might actually be more anxiety inducing, and it might actually be more uncomfortable for women who have to, deal with kind of attempts at perhaps socially anxious young men coming on to them and maybe getting aggressive and if they're rejected. We also might consider that a far greater danger to women is somebody who's like a really jealous or insecure boyfriend. They're very much a bigger danger than a sexless young man on the internet. But, we don't think about these things. So the solutions to incels problems is not that clear to me. But yeah, how much of it is are incels this way because of their inability to find a mate, or are they unable to find a mate because of these characteristics? It's likely a bidirectional effect.
Yeah, I think that's, just kind of thinking down the road here, that can be somewhat challenging and trying to maybe, aid or treat, incels that are trying to, not feel these ways, or some of those mental health components of it. I guess, let me just go back, because I do want to talk about the identity and the online culture and the manosphere and all this stuff. But before we get there, I just want to real quick ask about some of the sexual selection stuff. So I've talked about that a lot here with various folks, and we can talk about it evolutionarily, and then we can talk about some of the more recent data. But you talked about mate choice a little bit, but maybe you talk about how this coevolution with males and females, mate choice connects with incels. I know you've mentioned it a little bit, but just maybe expand on that. And what do we think about sexual ornamentation and also the ornamental mind as well? Because how are we looking at both of it for the body and the mind?
Yeah, certainly. So I do find it just utterly fascinating to think about human mating as like an engine, in that the mind of one sex helps to shape the body and mind of the other. Mm-hmm. That always just astounds me.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's actually quite beautiful to think that there's a co-evolution going on all the time. So I think for me, one of the most interesting lenses through which to view modern mating is around this idea of evolutionary mismatch. And E.O. Wilson has a great quote where he describes that the real problem of humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And I think that really describes mismatch, this idea that our current environments are radically different than the environments in response to which our psychology evolved. So if we think about it, in our ancestral conditions, populations were small, the number of potential mates was even smaller, and mate choice was heavily influenced by third-party or parental preferences. So you weren't just totally responsible for your own mating choices and behaviors. If we compare that to Tinder, the modern mating market of online, where 40% plus of couples report to have met now, they have 75 million people who use Tinder every month. So it's a huge radical difference. That's the epitome of evolutionary mismatch, in my opinion. Dating apps expose us to more potential mates in one day than our ancestors would have met in a lifetime. And we evolved to assess mates or potential mates in person. The information on a dating app is really impoverished. It's strategically curated. It's sometimes deceptive. It lacks in like scent, chemical, and audio cues. So certain pieces of data like height or a job become overly prioritized. And particularly for me, it might reduce the opportunity for a nice, charming Irish accent to overcompensate for being 5'7" in height, but I'm not too sore about that. But
I'm sure we all love your Irish accent. I mean, who doesn't love a good Irish accent? Come on now.
I've been maxing my entire life, dining out on the accent. But this idea of women selecting for mates that would have been very important ancestrally, such as height and resources, is perhaps even in itself an example of mismatch, because they maybe shouldn't be the most salient traits to assess mates on now. And there's a study that really brings this into focus. So a recent study from 2022 investigating how our evolved mate preferences interact with this online technology suggests that this over-prioritizing of that limited information like job and height is exactly what is happening. So my former supervisor, Andrew Thomas, and Peter Jonason, they used cross-cultural data from 1.8 million online daters from 24 different countries. And what they did was they created a measure of how much attention each profile received. So, for example, messages, likes, winks, and they called these indicators of interest, IOIs. They also created a measure of competence, which was comprised of a person's income and their level of education. So a depressing initial finding they had was they found extreme inequality on the mating market. So most users had few IOIs, often nothing at all, while others attracted hundreds of messages. What they also found was that resource acquisition ability, which was indicated by their education and income, improved the attention received for men by almost 2.5 times the rate of women. So you have these kind of traits on a dating app, and to put that into focus on something like height, I heard the relationship data scientist from Hinge, Logan Urey. She was talking on a podcast, and she talked about how if women in America set their height parameters for limiting their matches to only men over 6 foot, they limit themselves to something like 18% of America. If they set it to 6'3", they limit it to 3% of America. Wow. So it's really like, why would you shrink the sex ratio of your potential mating pool by focusing so much on these perhaps mismatched heights or preferences? And another example could be that autistic traits. Many incels report to be autistic, and it's something we're hoping to measure in our next study. They're not really. They could some autistic traits like that kind of mental, hyper focus for coding and things like that could be potentially very adaptive in a modern environment where like coding jobs are really important now. But they're not being sexually selected for because they're not seen as sexy. So it's like this mismatch could be really approaching an even more radically mismatched world.
But isn't that some of that part of the just kind of our evolutionary code, like some of the things that we have over thousands of years, where we have, again, thousands of years of doing this type of mate choice that we still have. Not that we're determined or we're destined to do this stuff necessarily, but that it worked for a long time, and it's hard to kind of shake that into maybe some of our evolutionary DNA of sorts to look at other things in a more modern setting that's been so in the grand scheme of things new and recent.
Yeah, for sure. It's really hard to shake that evolved psychology. But one thing that gives me maybe some cause for optimism on that is that our mate preferences and overall just social psychology is very attuned to status and social norms and things like that. So we have a high degree of malleability around that. So, what we decide to attach status to could maybe change. So, for example, a stay-at-home dad, that could be a more high-status thing to do, and it would liberate women even more into the workplace, that they could be the career breadwinner, and the stay-at-home dad could help with that. But in recent studies, we find that just 5% of young women said that they desired a relationship where they work full-time and the male partner works part-time or not at all. So that's pretty stark. So maybe I should be more pessimistic about that.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is interesting as we're continuing to evolve in modernity and how things are, and as we get equality with men and for women in many categories. Some of our norms, I think, are changing. And it's really interesting to see how it develops. Kind of my question here on this is more recently, and I'm sure you've seen this, is that there seems to be a lack of sexual activity for people overall and for men specifically. There's data showing that millennials and young people are waiting to get married, if at all, later in life. They're having, one or even no children. And just young people aren't having as much sex as people in generations past have done. What are your, I guess, general thoughts on this, and where do you think maybe incels fit into this picture?
Yeah, so you could describe like the incel piece as just one symptom of this broader kind of mating crisis. So if we put the incel piece into scale, there's between 60,000 and 100,000 incels who actively participate in online forums globally. there may be a lot more who identify with a definition of incels beyond the online world. But some factors that could lead into this more sexlessness generally is that people are living at home longer. Our findings showed that incels were way more likely to live with their parents still, so that could be causing difficulty. You could have better sex education, less drink and drug taking in young people, which probably has an effect on sexual experiences as well. But it might be this kind of mating crisis of women beginning to outpace men in higher education and the workplace. And it means that they no longer need to settle for someone out of the economic necessity or the strict social norm. They'd rather stay single than settle for a mate that they don't want. You also have maybe some corporate drives looking into this, like so dating apps, even if we look at them in isolation, it's actually in their business plan to have for people to stay single. That's they're kind of driving to encourage that. So yeah, and you also have like big corporate giants like Morgan Stanley forecasting that by the year 2030, 45% of women between the age of 25 and 44 will be single and childless. And, you know, that's great for them because they get access to this talent pool of, kick-ass women in the workplace in a brain-based economy now. That's good for them. It's not entirely clear that single and childless by 40 is, the goal for most women. So I get a little bit of pushback from this about when I talk about this mating crisis, because there is some evidence that there is a decline in hypergamy and that women are increasingly marrying men who are less educated than themselves. And I think that that's inevitable if you consider the pace at which women are beginning to outpace men in education. That many of them are beginning to mate down, so to speak. But even the authors of that study said that they couldn't speak to the perceived difficulty of women's search for mates. So, and other evidence points to a mismatch in the marriage market and a lack of eligible men. So it might be, it's not clear exactly how women feel about having to mate down, but there is some data points we can look at that maybe are some unintended consequences of this decline in hypergamy. So alongside this decline in hypergamy, it occurs in lockstep with increases in rates of female infidelity. So rates of infidelity among men have remained pretty stable over time. They've increased by 40%, but there's some data to show that they have increased by 40% among women in the last half century. And there's another even more kind of dark data point to talk about, is that a recent study of 21,000 women in 27 European countries found that women who were higher educated or earned more than their partners were more likely to report all types of intimate partner violence. And that makes sense from an evolutionary point of view, whereby men are most likely to go for a cost-inflicting rather than benefit-provisioning mate retention strategy when they feel at risk of losing their partner. And if their partner is less dependent on them, occupying high-status positions in her own right, she's surrounded by more high-status males that he's competing with, that insecurity might come online, and that's when the cost-inflicting mate retention behaviors and come online for the man to try to lower her self-esteem. It's a really dark finding, but it is important to think about when we describe this mating crisis. It's not just as simple as, oh yes, women will begin to marry men who are less educated and earn less than themselves. No problem. I don't know how women feel about having to do that. I don't know if you can look past the other unintended consequences of that too.
Yeah. I mean, I know. Obviously, I'm sure you're well aware of the work that David Buss has done. He wrote that book recently, a year or two ago, about how men behave badly, and talks a lot about intimate partner violence and many of the issues surrounding this. So you're kind of posing a good reminder here of some of the complications of this stuff. So I want to ask about identity. Right. We've talked about this or alluded to this. So I want to talk about kind of this online culture. So for many people, including myself, when I first heard the term incel, And a lot of these terms you've listed, Chads and Stacy's, it's just a very online kind of thing. So do we feel in more recent times, and maybe there's just not enough data on it? I mean, obviously you're doing work on it, maybe a few others, but is this just, did this kind of come about online, or online, social media, forums, etc., was just the kind of highway for this stuff to kind of really get animated? And then, so I guess, where does it start? Was it actually in reality, or was it just online and then it got exported to the real world? Kind of just talk us through as much as you know about kind of the origins of the space of the world in which this stuff originates and inhabits, and then how we have it now as a type of identity thing.
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, yeah, it again gets back to this point of the online subculture is one thing, but the people who are disenfranchised with the mating market might include a whole bigger sphere of society. But one good thing about my data that I got in our study was that I got a mix of forum using online incels and incels who didn't use the forum. So I talked about how I began to think about what incels get out of their identity. And there is some data on this, and 3/4 of incels said that using the forums, being online, made them feel understood, less lonely, and provided a sense of belonging. But a little over half reported that the forum made them feel hopeless. So I wanted to kind of investigate, was there any big differences between my forum using participants and non-forum using ones? So forum use predicted greater anxiety. 37% of those who said they used forums said that it made their well-being much or somewhat better. 39% were not sure, and 24% thought that it worsened their well-being. Only 20% of incels indicated that they do not believe they will be involuntary celibate for the rest of their life. And this belief in the permanency of inceldom significantly predicted depression and low life satisfaction. So it's a bit of a mixed bag of what's the effect the forums are having on well-being. But in terms of the effect it's having on their participation in the mating market, I think that's significant, because I believe that incel forums and the community itself, while it might be a source of camaraderie and well-being for some, it's almost invariably limiting for their engaging in the mating market. There's some studies have found that in the forums, if an individual incel reports to have had any romantic success or was going on a date or something, they might get kicked out of the forum. So it's like this online identity becomes, it's so valuable to them as a form of kind of coalition that they're reluctant to maybe lose it. So it's complicated. But like I said, it's not clear that engaging with the mating market is the clear answer that we want for all incels. But it's a complex relationship with the online component, and there might be a lot of individual differences between which incels it makes things worse for and which it helps.
Yeah. That's what I'm wondering here. This feels, I don't know if my words are right, but it almost feels sadomasochistic almost. Right, that I'm doomed for this. I can't get any pleasure, and I'm going to continue to have this kind of suffering. And now I've curated a type of identity around this. Then you get other folks in this space, and then there's this shaming of like all these things, like you're mentioning on forums and things like that. Again, maybe for some, maybe not for all, of course. But does it feel like it has a type of it's definitely a subculture. I mean, I'm not going to throw words around like, a cult or things like that, but does it feel very kind of insulated, where it's like you're one of us or you're not? I mean, what do we think in terms of like kind of the group identity of this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. And then you form new status hierarchies in that group. And that's something we're looking to investigate in the next study, is like, what's the shape of these networks and what function do they fill? But yeah, it could be, it's very wallowing, right? It's very much, they're very concerned with, is someone a true cell or a fake cell? Any evidence? They engage in what I consider self-verification. So they're constantly seeking information that validates their worldview. And, we live in the internet world now. I always make this point, no matter what stance, if I wake up in the morning and I say, I want to find loads of evidence that the world is misandrist against men. I could find a ton. But if I woke up the next day and said, I want to find a ton of evidence that shows the world is misogynistic, you could also find a ton. So in a golden internet age, you can kind of hunker down into whatever worldview you want. And, it's almost like information overload. So we form these rubrics. And especially if you're depressed and under stress, you'll form an even more black and white rubric to explain the world. And that's what you do. And you go out and find the ton of information that supports that. That's what I think is happening with the incel.
It's very... I hate talking about this, blaming everything on online and social media. Obviously, it's a factor for basically every aspect of our lives. And there's a lot of negative things, but it does seem like a lot of this stuff is getting, again, animated, and a lot of firing power from, this kind of online kind of culture and how it's, now in the real world. I guess to that end, I want to talk about masculinity generally, right? Because but I want to, before we get there, I guess talk about the manosphere. I know this is a word that gets thrown around as well. Where does that come into play here? Maybe talk about that. What it is and how that gets kind of in the mix.
Sure. So the manosphere kind of describes a collection of subgroups that are kind of interested in masculinity and things like this. But they're not really cohesive. Like you have pickup artists, you have MGTOW, which describes men going their own way, who are men who think that they probably could get sexual relationships, but don't consider that they think they're not worth. You have incels, you have red pill kind of people who are trying to lift the lid and show people what women are really like. So they're all very kind of have very different motives and standpoints. And a lot of the manosphere might actually really sneer at incels. They might punch down on them. So it's not like this cohesive group. But it's very interesting in the way they link together. So there is one paper that found a direct pipeline from pickup artist communities to incel forums. So many incels describe themselves as people who tried the pickup artist routines and even in some cases paid a lot of money to go for these workshops. And, they found that it didn't work. And then they reached the conclusion, I must be incel. So I'll need a different radically online world and just give up. It is, so that was an interesting finding of that kind of pipeline. But I just find that this whole idea, like the idea of male development to pursue romance automatically descends into toxicity or gets framed as misogynistic no matter what. And when you do that, so to give you an example of this, a couple of years ago, Barack Obama wrote his autobiography. Mm-hmm. And in it, he wrote a couple of chapters about what it was like in college. And he described reading different types of literature to impress different types of women. So he was like, I'll read this Marxist literature and talk about it with this girl in my sociology class or whatever it was. Right. And, as a man reading that seems very intuitive. Like, but it's very motivational to think of developing yourself to get the girl, get the goal, get the girl. It's kind of like the trope that's very motivational for men. And, the idea of romantic success coming with status is very intuitive to men. But he got lambasted in the media as kind of misogynistic or manipulative, that he shouldn't have been doing that with the goal of achieving romantic success. And that just didn't seem so strange to me. And when you do that, and even like more Jordan Peterson style self-development, it gets framed as kind of misogynistic. And if you leave a gap like that, then it gets filled with the likes of Andrew Tate, who, there's this appetite for men to kind of learn how to develop themselves, particularly to achieve romantic success. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I do think there is maybe a space for like an ethical pickup artistry world, or even just more general male self-development. But it's constantly framed as misogynistic, no matter what, which is unusual. And Jordan Peterson even talks about it. He says women should be interested in this project too, because don't they want more competent partners? And that makes a lot of sense to me. On the one hand, you have women often complaining about the lack of eligible men, but then really there's no space for an ethical kind of self-development world for men. My buddy who runs the Modern Wisdom podcast, Chris Williamson, he has a great idea about what he describes as the third wave of the red pill. So he thinks that this third wave of red pill thinking that needs to come will involve men and women working more together to consider each other's sexual psychology and consider each other's standpoint. The second wave of red pill, or current iteration that we have of it, is very much hunkered down into identity politics and very kind of antagonistic to each other. And that might die away, and people might have an appetite for something a bit more beneficial for both. Because when I describe this mating crisis, it hurts both sexes. It hurts highly educated women who have, high standards for their mate. They need more eligible partners out there. And I know you had Dr. Reeves on, who wrote the of Boys and Men. Fantastic collection of evidence that men are really struggling. And they need focused interventions on helping them.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Richard Reeves wrote a fantastic book, Boys and Men. We had a fantastic conversation, and he's wonderful. He's looking at the hard data, and he's trying to have a very balanced approach at trying to say, look, there's these issues with men, and that's not to demonize women or that women don't have issues, but we also do need to look at some of these things. And he navigates that minefield pretty well, I think, although he does have his critics. I guess that's my question, though, is I'm not going to name names necessarily, but it does feel like with men's issues, whatever they may be, or even in how we're understanding masculinity and modern masculinity, we have this very, it seems like everything else, this kind of extremism that goes on, right? So it's, in many cases, you have some intellectual thinkers or public figures or et cetera that are saying, to be a dude, you need to have just this like 1950s traditional, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not saying that that's a negative thing. I'm not saying that people can't subscribe to some of that. There's nothing wrong with some components of, traditional masculinity. There are definitely negative components as well, for sure. So I don't think it's, it's a a whole, you got to get the whole thing there. I think you can pull for some pieces of it, being very courteous, being a provider, not that women can't provide for themselves, but, the intention, having some, I think, some aspects of chivalry, I think, I think you can, be very invested in family and, whatever it is, right? I mean, you could lay some of this stuff out. But on the other extreme of this thing is kind of what you're saying, and the identity politics end of it is, well, if you want to be a man in 2023, you basically have to, emasculate yourself and concede everything's patriarchy and women need to rule the world. And that's obviously, not everybody. And, that's a kind of extreme version, but you get elements of that. And I think we see some of that kind of what you're saying, this whole of, people that are trying to say, let's have some improvements for the modern man. It's always just, misogynistic. As soon as someone doesn't agree with all of it or some of it or whatever. Now, I will say, for some of these individuals that are talking about this, it is a kind of flattened view. It is a very old-fashioned view. And much of these individuals' public thoughts or commentary on other issues kind of poisons the well there. So I think that's a problem. It's very hard for people in general to just parse things out of, this person can have really good ideas on this topic and be absolutely misinformed or too hostile on other topics. It's just very hard for people to do that. I mean, I'm more and more convinced people can't hold two different ideas in their head at the same time. But maybe some people can, but it just feels like that's not the case. So all this to say, it's very difficult of where I think men should look to try and get some, if you will, advice, or if you will, direction about men's issues, without getting these kind of extremes. And so I guess, what are your thoughts about that? I mean, you can disagree with me, obviously, but what are your thoughts about that? And just where do we see all of these different components of the quote unquote manosphere, where incels are fitting in there? And just, I think, men in general they're not misogynistic, right? But they don't want to emasculate themselves. They care about equality. They care about women's issues, but they're not full-blown feminists per se. I mean, where do you just kind of see on this kind of continuum of modern masculinity, and what are some of the answers that are in the public space that are just kind of extreme? How do you kind of, think about these things?
I think Richard Reeves does such a fantastic job with this, because when you make it such a third rail to touch, this idea of more positive masculinity or developing the material conditions of young men's lives in all these ways, no matter how much data you have, even he gets his critics. He does such a great job of walking that line, but he's pointing out the problem, and maybe people are waking up to it on the back of his book. Because it's both sexes that suffer. Warren Farrell wrote a book one time called The Myth of Male Power, and he talks about how when one sex loses, both sexes lose. And that's true.
Right.
I think there's been concerted efforts in recent years to try and make men and women more and more antagonistic towards each other. Mm-hmm. And on the one hand, I kind of laugh in the face of that, because it's coming up against hundreds of thousands of years of selection pressures to make us love each other and rely on each other. Now, there are economic forces that it's making us rely on each other maybe less, and that's worth thinking about. And what kind of role do we occupy for each other? And maybe it's a scary frontier that we're about to cross. But we are each other's biggest allies. And I do think for women, most men in their lives are overwhelmingly positive. They're the brothers, sons, fathers that for the most part love and support them. Obviously, some women have some other terrible experiences. But I think we have to find a way back to being cohesive allies. We're more of a cooperative endeavor from an evolutionary point of view than enemies. Men typically compete with other men rather than with women. So we need to get back to seeing the world that way.
I totally agree with you. I absolutely agree with you on everything you said. I do think it is one of the, people talk about equality, and I certainly agree with that and have supported that and pushed for that, tremendously. I do think we don't talk enough about some of the, I don't want to say downsides, but some of the growing pains of that. So if you have in a workforce parity, right? 50% women, 50% men, let's say, in whichever category. Well, you're going to have to compete. And if you've been competing men with men for thousands of years or whatever, hundreds of years, in terms of the roles of whatever the job requires or wherever the arena is, there is a competition. There's a healthy, it doesn't need to be nefarious. There's a healthy competition of getting promoted or getting a raise or getting accolades or doing really good work or whatever. And just throwing men and women and saying, well, we have equality now, and expecting it to be just this seamless, wonderful, with no hiccups, no growing pains is pretty, fanciful in my mind. But my thing is, well, how do we just build and develop an ethic of, okay, if men and women are actually competing in certain arenas in a healthy way, that's fine. That's great. But how do we have an ethic that looks different and that we evolve that, where there isn't, men get more of the raises or more of the promotions. It is merit-based. It is based on what someone's able to do, that there is less of a smaller and smaller or none, pay gap in certain sectors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those things are important. But I think what gets frustrating is when you have certain public thinkers or intellectuals or whatever, or influencers just talking about this antiquated 1950s model, and that's what we need to get back to. It's just very regressive. It just doesn't make sense for, again, a modern 2023, 21st century way of doing things. You can maybe pull elements from that, but I just don't. It just seems very regressive and not forward thinking. And on the other hand, it's saying that if there's a healthy competition or whatever, and if you're going to do that, and anything opposed to that, you're misogynistic, you're sexist, what all these things, that's also preposterous as well. So I think I agree with your larger point that a lot of this stuff is generating for men and women are in competition with each other on every single thing all the time. And I don't know how true that is. I think some of that might be the case, but that doesn't mean it's always bad. And how do we just have a modern 21st century ethic in those arenas with equality?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, like, it's neither realistic nor desirable to rewind the clock to this 1950s kind of style thing. Even if you just look at economics alone, liberating women into the workplace has been such a net boon for the GDP of countries. Absolutely. That you're not going to rewind the clock, and it is a brain-based economy now, so they're absolutely going to be killing it in the workplace. So that's not realistic or desirable. But you do have to kind of contend then with what does that look like, because with that success, you do women's socioeconomic success combined with their more ancient kind of mate preferences for similarly high-achieving men. It leads to this skewed sex ratio of highly educated and selective women to economically unattractive men. And Rob Brooks actually has a great paper, along with Candace Blake, that it could link incel activity to the social mating ecology. And he found in his model that gender pay gaps actually alleviate mating market competition for both sexes. Because with our evolved mate preferences, men don't actually discriminate. They will consider lower educated women, whereas women tend to not, for the most part, consider lower educated men. So actually a wider gender pay gap actually alleviates the competition for both. And he could predict areas of incel activity, geographically predict areas of high online incel activity using three variables: high levels of income inequality, low gender pay gaps, and male biased sex ratio, so fewer single women. So, this kind of cultural skew of women to eligible men is really important to think about. And I don't think that's, front and center in the conversation when anyone is talking about, closing gender pay gaps and kind of supporting women in STEM and these kind of movements.
Yeah, no, I agree. Now, before we move on to some of the perspectives, I do want to ask about we've been talking a lot about opposite sex attraction. I don't know if there's any literature here or anything on same-sex attraction or anything in between. This is usually kind of men with women kind of thing, but is there anything about men with men or folks that are in between, non-binary, non-conforming? Again, I know this stuff is still very in its infancy of research, but anything that is possible at all about the data on that dynamic?
Yeah, actually, there's some really cool work being done from Dan Conroy Beam's lab, where he's analyzing how similar LGBTQ plus sexual psychology is. And if I could just pull it up for you in one second, yeah. Some of the findings. There we go. He was investigating, do LGBTQ plus people have distinct sexual psychologies? And he found that they don't really, but the sexes do. So basically, him and his team, using machine learning, they could predict a person's sex with 69% of accuracy, but sexual orientation with only 33% of accuracy, using data on their mating psychology. So, for example, their mate preferences. What is interesting is that transgender participants, their mating psychology aligned more with their gender identity than with their sex assigned at birth. Mating psychology then seems more sexually dimorphic, around male and female having different sexual psychologies, but not as specific to sexual orientation. So that means gay men have similar sexual psychologies to heterosexual men, except obviously different in one fundamental way. And you might kind of see this in, I think it's kind of like a common, and maybe a true stereotype, that gay men tend to be a bit more promiscuous than lesbian women. And that's because you've removed the female choice. You've kind of got two sexual protagonists in two men, facing no barrier of female choosiness. So they're able to have as much short-term mating as they want. So that is an interesting finding about different sexual orientations, sexual psychology, but definitely an under-researched area, and an opportunity for any young scholar to kind of go out and do more of these. All we know about mating psychology, just investigate it in these new identities and populations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. So I guess we've been talking a lot about all the components of incels, and many other kind of surrounding topics here. Masculinity, sexuality, evolution, things like that. But I guess one of the things I want to kind of chat about here is how people in society receive incels. That there's an impression that people have about incels. So once they kind of figure out what it is, and the concept, and then who these people are and how these things, there seems to be a lot of shame, judgment, negative attributions, etc. I don't know if maybe others view it positively or not, but how do you think people receive incels in society?
Well, I think they're basically, incels are like a socially sanctioned punching bag now for everyone to kind of just tee off on and hate. And we do a couple of things with them that we don't do with other groups. With other groups, we very much acknowledge that it's wrong and bad to judge the whole group by the actions of an extreme minority. But with incels, that's exactly what we do. And we're readily keen to do it. So just to illustrate that a little bit more, to put the incel violence into perspective. So we've talked about there might be between 60,000 to 100,000 online subculture incels. Due to young male syndrome, we would maybe expect the violence to be a lot more. But let's put that violence into perspective. There's been 59 people killed worldwide by known associations with incel violence. And I don't mean to demean any of the lives lost in those tragic attacks, but that is not that big compared to other extremist or terrorist groups, which incels often get described as like the new terrorist threat. 10 of those deaths alone can be accounted for by the actions of Alec Manassian. Alec Manassian drove his van into a crowd of people in Toronto in 2017, and he killed 10 people. And he's constantly held up as the poster boy of the incel movement. In every news article about incels, you'll hear them talk about Alec Manassian, because before he did what he did, he released a Facebook post talking about how he would spark an incel rebellion and all hail Elliot Rodger, and he's going to overthrow all the Chads and Stacys. So it's very kind of salacious stuff. You can see why the media maybe grabs onto it. But what's less often reported is the judge's verdict on the Alec Manassian case. So I can read directly from that verdict to you. The judge in her statement said, he told lies deliberately to depict the killings as being connected to the incel movement and to get more media attention. He piggybacked on the incel movement to ratchet up his own notoriety, and his story to the police about the incel attack being as part of an incel rebellion was a lie. So, I really think that the media is irresponsible with these, even with the high-profile incel attacks themselves. And they should incorporate, in my opinion, a no notoriety protocol. Because if you think about any would-be spree killer, if they see their interviews and their Facebook posts and everything being splashed all over the media, that's notoriety that they will crave, and it'll inspire more future spree killers. But anyway, so we, as society, we tend to judge them by the actions of the most extreme. We elevate our disgust at the misogyny up to the level of fear, and exaggerate the level of danger. And we also it feels kind of good to have a group that we can punch down towards. I think this happens differently for men and women. So men kind of celebrate, they sneer at incels because it highlights their own sexual abundance, because it's like, oh, who could ever describe themselves as an incel? They're obviously just way more inept than me, who's out here having loads of sex, Mm-hmm. Whereas while women do it to kind of almost pretend that it's, it's like they dismiss them as unworthy suitors and dispel them as just misogynistic and creepy, while it doesn't acknowledge that the dating market is competitive, hierarchical, and often cruel, and maybe even sometimes superficial. And that fact is kind of uncomfortable for any of us who value egalitarianism. So we kind of maybe pretend that it must be incels' their own fault. They must just have awful personalities. And, that's not really fair, because to make the argument that, oh, it must be all about personalities, you can't simply conjure up a winning personality. And it's very hard, and particularly if you're unattractive and socially awkward, that's pretty tough to do. And people we have the halo effect, where we consider those having good looks as having more attractive personalities anyway. And there's like a minimum level of attractiveness to be reached before personalities can kind of override. So it's a little bit kind of unfair to do that. But yeah, and we just kind of don't take seriously the material conditions that are contributing to these young men's plight.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because I've heard this thing about the violence thing, but as you're saying, it seems, it's not good, and that violence is never good, but it seems minimal in the grand scheme of things. Is that a concern, like a legitimate concern, is like the violence piece, or is it just, are there other concerns? I guess when people in society, like, what's there's maybe a kind of generalization, or maybe just a general dislike towards a group or something. But are there actual legitimate concerns that people in society may have about incels, in society?
Like we've talked about, but those concerns may be misaligned, and that there doesn't seem to be the concerns that I think are needed about the suicidality, which seems a more likely extremism in the community. I think the sense of fear gets ratcheted up in extremis by the media.
Yeah.
For all the evolutionary reasons we've talked about with young male syndrome and all that, they should represent a pretty destabilizing portion of society, but they don't seem to be, perhaps due to the online worlds. But yeah, like we said, the scale of violence is minimal compared to other terrorist threats. And we read articles all the time about how incels should be considered a terrorist threat. And, that it just doesn't make sense to me, because terrorist groups have a very clear end goal and solution to the group's problems that they agree on how they would reach that end goal. That is just not there in incels. And there is no, as far as we know, any offline group of incels. They're just an online group. And this threat from online radicalization, in my opinion, gets over-exaggerated too. And I would describe it, thinking about an incel terrorist group, I would describe it as kind of as unlikely as the new Batman film. Have you seen the new Batman film?
The one with Pattinson?
Yes, with the Riddler. So in the film, spoiler alert for anyone who's listening, the Riddler is the villain, and he essentially mobilizes what could be described as an army of disenfranchised young men, maybe like incels. And I just thought, logistically, that would be such a nightmare to coordinate and arrange. A terrorist plot of some description, it takes a lot of organization. What maybe is in danger is these spree killings, which are most often suicides as well. They're people who've killed a lot of people and then know that they're going to die by suicide by cop or kill themselves as well. Those kind of lone wolf attacks, they're more likely. But as a terrorist organized group, an organized ideology, I just don't see that.
Yeah. No, I hear you. So I guess in terms of clinical treatment, so we kind of talked about how incels and certain men, maybe loosely associated with this, or even larger in this manosphere, are looking to public intellectuals or people that are, maybe YouTubers or influencers or certain podcasts, which is, I think there's pros and cons to those things. I'm not dismissing those things, but in terms of like actual clinical treatment for folks, you talked about the mental health concerns, loneliness, suicidality, depression, anxiety, etc. Where do you think there's room or space to invest in helping men structurally and systematically that are in this kind of category, effectively, so they aren't, suffering in many of these ways?
Yeah, so they represent a really at-risk and hard-to-reach group. And I'm not a clinical psychology student. I'm not really a mental health expert. But I thought when the main part of our findings were such extremely low levels of well-being, I thought I should dig in to that literature a bit and give some sort of suggestions of what might be worth exploring in terms of mental health intervention. And I think there really is the need for a specific brand or type of incel therapy to meet these guys' needs, because they're so disenfranchised with mental health interventions. So their immediate outset is total cynicism that in the past they've never been taken seriously when they bring up these problems. So they've described an extreme cynicism and poor experiences with mental health. So I would recommend that any such specific bespoke interventions that might be designed, they might take into account our findings about this tendency for interpersonal victimhood. So part of that was the need for recognition, the legitimacy of a grievance being important to be acknowledged. So mental health professionals who are overly challenging, they maybe run the risk of alienating incels who may feel their experiences are not seen as valid. And I think, in terms of the effectiveness of a mental health intervention, one of the strongest predictors of whether a mental health intervention will be effective or not is the strength of the relationship between the therapist and client. And creating rapport is just completely essential. I also think that this idea that victimhood mindset tends to lead to this external locus of control. So I think it should be very important to help incels create this internal locus of control where they feel they can affect change in their own life. Because challenging that black pill kind of thinking might be very important for incels, because this belief in the permanency of your inceldom, that it was never going to change, that was a significant predictor of depression in our findings. I've also think that there's a real role for evolutionary psychologists here, because not many mental health professionals have a knowledge of and respect for evolutionary psychology, but incels often you know about evolutionary psychology and sometimes use cherry pick specific findings to fuel their worldview, but they're going to dismiss any mental health professional who dismisses evolutionary psychology as just completely lacking in credibility. So there's an opportunity, and I would even say obligation, for evolutionary psychologists to be part of the solution to this problem. If incels are indeed taking some of our findings, misappropriating them, not engaging with other findings from evolutionary psychology, we need to maybe step up and be part of that solution. And you do find that some of the best research into incel psychology is coming from the field of evolutionary psychology. And I think that's important, because I wasn't happy as an evolutionary psychologist to shy away from the problem and say, oh, that incels are using our findings sometimes. Well, that's nothing to do with us. We need to kind of step up to the plate and be part of the solution, I think. I also think maybe there's scope for incels who want to participate in the mating market to improve on their mating intelligence. So mating intelligence can be described as like a collection of mental adaptations that generate adaptive mating strategies for people. So one component of that is this idea we talked about of the cross-sex mind reading. So it's like theory of mind applied to the mating domain. It could include like the ability to accurately ascertain what traits members of the opposite sex value. So a significant finding in our next paper that we're preparing right now, actually, which hasn't been peer reviewed as of yet, but part of the same dissertation data set, we compared incels and non-incels in terms of their perceptions of female mate preferences. And we compared them with the female participants' actual mate preferences. So we found that incels particularly underestimated women's preferences for things like loyalty and dependability, kindness, emotional maturity and stability, intelligence, humor, kindness, all these warmth kind of qualities. And they significantly overestimated the physical attractiveness and financial resources, although the non-incel men in the sample did this too. So helping incels learn actually, you could improve your mating intelligence and your mating acumen, and you could improve your prospects. Because one thing about male mate value is it's a lot more malleable and based around things like status, like financial prospects and things like that, much more so than female mate value, which is more so geared towards youth and fertility, which is very fixed. So, with the exception of height, most men can often change their mate value. You can always accrue more status. You can always get yourself into a better financial situation, but that's where part of the solution might be just improve the material conditions of men's lives. That might be enough to put a dent in the problem.
Yeah. One thing you were saying about, clinical psych is in my world as well. So it's one of those things that, it's interesting to see that overwhelmingly when you think about transferable skills or best practices or common practices, overwhelmingly, regardless of interventions that are used with any type of issue, or, there's exceptions to that, but overwhelmingly, regardless of theoretical orientation you're using, one of the key components of the therapeutic process is the therapeutic relationship. It's essential. It's absolutely essential, because at the end of the day, you have a human being talking to another human being, in a professional context of which we've, designed for the past 120 years or whatever. But that's really essential. That's really, really, really important. And so, it's such a growing kind of field of research on the research end, but also when we start looking at treatment, having clinicians that want to work with these folks, to really have ways in which they connect us as with people and in that therapeutic relationship. So I think even just something kind of your basic foundational principle of therapeutic dynamics still applies regardless of again intervention, orientation, of theory, etc.
Totally agree. Yeah.
You kind of mentioned it, so I was just wondering. So you've done a lot of work with this stuff. So maybe this is a little bit more, I guess, quasi personal. But I know you switched over to the bus lab, which we mentioned, and what are you working on now on this stuff? You've done a lot of work on this. So what are the papers you're working on now, and what are your ideas, I guess, in terms of the research of where you're headed?
So we actually have a new big incel study that we're going to launch in a couple of weeks. We're going to have a website about ourselves, my co-authors and I, kind of explaining who we are and what we're about. It'll have a mission statement on it, because incels are, in my opinion, perhaps rightly in some cases, cynical of some academic studies into their community. So we wanted to kind of lay out who we are, what we're aiming to do, examples of our previous research, examples of our interviews, and we'll actually be in a position to pay incels for this next study to do a long 45-minute study, investigate a lot of different things, and get some more of that hard data. We hope it'll be the biggest incel study out there by the time we finish. And we want to use that as the basis to maybe think about designing some interventions thereafter. I am interested in studying the incel topic a lot more, but I'm branching out into other projects too. A theoretical paper on this broader mating crisis we're looking at writing. I always say it's an interesting time to be studying human mating, but I think it always will be. It's the number one problem. It's the only game in town, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, I was going to ask also here, you kind of were answering it, but I was curious about, how you got interested in kind of just more specifically or personally in studying incels, and then where do you feel you're branching out or whatever, which you kind of answer, but just generally, what got you interested in doing so much of this work, and then because when you study a topic, it consumes your life and time and energy, and so you kind of have to like it a little bit, you find it interesting, and as you keep doing that, where do you see yourself branching out and seeing doing some other types of research?
Yeah, so my co-author always makes the joke to me that research is me search. And I don't tend to comment on whether that's true in my interest of incel research. But I was interested in the topic kind of like culturally, pretty online person and interested in this stuff. And when I figured it was like a sweet spot of an academics area of research, because it had garnered a huge amount of mainstream media interest already, but virtually, at the time I started studying it, virtually no academic study. So it's pretty cool to be able to get in at the ground floor of something, and from a career move, maybe it's a good thing to kind of have a topic niche kind of earlier. And I think it's going to grow in terms of academic study. We're seeing more and more studies all the time. So it was a really good one in terms of timing. I think it is one that should be concerning for all of us. I think it is just a symptom of this broader mating crisis, and that's the even more interesting stuff for me. But yeah, I think it's, and I also was interested in the fact that evolutionary psychology in particularly was kind of misappropriated and aligned with the incel movement. So I wanted to not shy away from the challenge and represent our field and engage with the topic. And yeah, I think I wasn't satisfied with the way the conversation around the incel topic that we were given in the mainstream kind of media or discourse. It seemed very insufficient to me. So hopefully in my own small way, I can add more value to the conversation and steer it towards what I think are more interesting ways to look at it, rather than just, oh, wow, there's some real bad misogyny from these guys,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, William, it's been so much fun talking to you. It's obviously been a long time coming. I know we were planning to do this for a couple months, and so I'm really glad to talk to you about something that you're doing good research on. And it's a topic that kind of gets talked about in kind of pedestrian ways, but you're really just kind of, like you said, right there at the on the ground doing the work. And so it's been super informative and illuminating, and I've really enjoyed talking to you about this, and I'm sure listeners will as well. Where's the best places to find your research, your papers, and the best places to connect with you?
So like many academics, I'm a terminally online person. So you can follow me on Twitter at Costello William, and you'll be able to, I'll post most of the things we've got going on. Google Scholar, if you want to find our academic papers, is always a good place to find me. But yeah, Twitter is probably the best.
Okay, that's great. And again, I just can't say enough thanks for you coming on, William, and sharing your research, and you have such a great energy, and I really did value this conversation highly. So I greatly appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, and look forward to chatting again in the future if we've got something new in the pipeline.
Absolutely. Thanks.